Great, we are live and welcome to our special Friday Funtime Transportation Wonk Talk event. Part of May is Bike Month and part of the City of Eugene Transportation Division's work to encourage more people to get out and enjoy this great month of May for biking. I'm very excited today. We have been doing a few of these live stream events, and we've done some on family biking and on our bike share system, and we have a few more planned. And tonight, I'm very excited to have our special Wonk Talk, where we can dive deep into the weeds of transportation planning and all things wonkiness. And I have some very special guests here with me tonight who are going to be helping us dive into those weeds. And we're going to remind everyone that the comment section is open, so I'll be watching the comments on Facebook and YouTube and throw in any questions, and along the way you'll help guide the conversation as well. But I know our panelists have plenty of experience and will be able to keep this conversation going even if you don't ask any questions. So first off, I will let everyone introduce themselves a bit, and then we'll do a quick little icebreaker question to just kind of get our juices flowing, and then see if any questions roll in and what topics people want to talk about. Otherwise, we have a few lined up as well. So my name is Shane Rhodes, and I'm the Transportation Options Coordinator for the City of Eugene. I'm very excited to be hosting these Transportation Tuesday and Friday Funtime events, and I'll hand it over to Rob. Which one?
Rob.
Robs. Let's go to Rob Inerfeld.
Hi there. I am Rob Inerfeld, and I'm a transportation planning manager for the City of Eugene. So I work with Shane and I like how Shane often refers to us as the Transportation Planning Department, although we're just a team of about 8 people. And I've been with the City of Eugene since 2005 when I moved here from Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is a streetcar suburb of Washington, D.C.
Great. How about the next Rob?
I'm also named Rob. I'm Rob Zako. I'm the Executive Director of Better Eugene Springfield Transportation. We're a local 501c3 nonprofit, and we formed in 2012 to support the West UGMX project. Today, we promote transportation options, safe streets, and walkable neighborhoods, and I'm happy to be part of this panel.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Lewis. I'm an associate professor in planning, public policy, and management at the U of O. And I also serve as the co-director of research for the Institute for Policy Research and Engagement. A lot of my research focuses on land use and growth management, but I'm particularly interested in the intersection of land use to transportation and climate change. And I've done some work, research work with Rob Zako, actually focusing on transportation funding and prioritization. We did some work on land use, climate change, and transportation a few years ago as well.
Great. Well, I'm really excited to have sort of a bit of a diverse mix of, municipality and advocacy and academics on the panel. And we're going to have a couple surprise guests join us a little bit later. We also have some trivia, some bits of giveaways, and some fun things coming up. And I'm going to kick us off with a little icebreaker question. So it's Friday, we're wrapping up work, and I know some of us have been working right up to the end here, and we'll even talk about some of the things we were just working on. But I wanted to start us off with a little icebreaker question for the panelists about what was your first job and how did transportation relate to it? So not necessarily a transportation job, but what was the first thing you did as a kid or older, first job, and how transportation related to it? So looks like Zako wants to kick us off.
Me. Straight out of high school, I went to work for the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, well, actually, suburb of Detroit, Michigan. And I forget what I did the first summer, but the second summer, I was responsible for tracking rail cars, delivering automotive parts from depots around the country. And I wrote programming in COBOL. So I think there was some transportation connection there.
Yeah, definitely.
My first job was lifeguard, to which transportation isn't very related. And I'll say the first year I was a lifeguard, I was 15 and I couldn't drive myself. And so I had to be driven to the pool a lot. And I grew up in a small town in Kentucky. And so driving was really the only option for me. So I was very excited about getting my license when I was 16 to get there. But more sort of related to transportation, my dad is a transportation engineer. And so I steered clear of transportation for as long as possible until it found its way to me. And now I do similar things to what my dad did.
Yeah, that's funny. So how did you get into, or how did you get to work when you were 15 but couldn't drive and driving was so necessary? Did your parents drive you?
My parents would drive me. My friends with cars would drive me. My grandmother would drive me around a lot. Wasn't great.
Yeah. All right, Rob?
My first job was making donuts on Sunday mornings at Schultz's Cider Mill in Armonk, New York. And what transportation was involved, because I would go in really early in the morning and I would mix up a big vat of donut mix, and then I would dump it into this other vat that on the bottom it had two plungers that would plunge each pair of donuts into the liquefied Crisco. And then they would be transported down like a conveyor belt, and then they would be flipped over so the other side would get cooked, and they would be transported all the way down to a slide at the end. So the donuts were getting transported, and they were delicious donuts. People would have them with like a hot cider and a cinnamon stick, and then I would either keep them plain, make them cinnamon sugar or powdered sugar, and people would wait online for these donuts for like half an hour. It was very popular. Now, my first job after college, it's funny because I was in a program at the University of Pennsylvania for college that was engineering and business. And I didn't really like either one of them very much, but I wasn't very self-reflective. I didn't think, oh, I can change my major. But I had one class on environmental impact assessment that was taught by the former deputy planning director of the state of Pennsylvania. And that led to me getting an internship with the Nature Conservancy, which led to me getting a job when I graduated with an environmental planning firm called McCormick, Taylor and Associates. And so they do different elements of environmental impact studies for transportation projects in the Northeast, mostly the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. So they actually sent me to Louisville University to be trained on how to do noise assessments for highway projects. And I would go all around rural Pennsylvania and set up noise monitors to see what the ambient noise levels were. And then I would actually digitize these on a computer and then I would put in the different roadway alternatives and determine whether noise barriers needed to be built. And the interesting thing is back then, we did not use computers at our desks. Nobody had a computer for work. We had to do everything by hand and give it to a person who was called a word processor who would type it up. But I did use a computer for the noise analysis. And so a lot of the projects around central Pennsylvania these were projects that were needed like 8 days a year when central Pennsylvania clogged up for Penn State football games. And so one of the projects, I went to State College, Pennsylvania, and I went on to the penitentiary, and they drove me around so I could set the noise monitor because they were looking at putting a roadway across the prison. So that was pretty interesting.
Wow, interesting. It's funny. I have to say my first real job, where I actually got paid money instead of comic books, because my first job was at a comic book store. But my first real job was also at a donut shop. I worked at Dunkin' Donuts.
Oh, wow.
And so transportation was definitely a piece of my whole puzzle of that job. And my parents either had to wake up at 4 something to get me to work to sell the donuts, or I would ride my bike. And this was in Anchorage, Alaska. So I could only ride, a few months out of the year, really. But I did that. I would ride, and I had my first bike crash on a shared use path that was on the side of a road. So it was a side path. And I was riding, the opposite direction of traffic on a one-way street, and got hit by a right turning car there. So I've had very few crashes in my life, but that was the one on my way to make the donuts.
Wow.
So, all right. So just a reminder to folks, you can send your comments in and we will answer some questions or lead the conversation. But for now, so I guess Rob talked a little bit about his first job that was transportation related as well. So I wanted to give Rob, Zako, and Rebecca a chance to talk about their first job that was really in the transportation field. I guess, Zako, yours was kind of in the transportation field in a way, but.
My first real job in transportation, I would say had to have been in Eugene. I sort of fell into it. I somehow got involved with Friends of Eugene about 20 years ago, and they were working on something called Transplan, which was the 20-year transportation system plan for the city, well, Eugene and Springfield and Lane County and LTD.
Yeah.
And one thing led to another, and I've been doing that ever since with different hats.
We probably ran across each other during that time because I was working for Peddlers Express when Transplan was being worked on, I believe, and went to a few of the early Transplan meetings. That was my first transportation job. I studied psychology at the U of O and became a cargo bike messenger as my first transportation job.
I vaguely remember you. Go ahead, Rob.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead. I'll follow up in a sec.
I vaguely remember my wife and I moved to Eugene a few years before that, about a year or so after CAT, Center for Appropriate Transport, had opened. And one of the reasons why we moved here is because we had read from Florida that there was this cool alternative transportation or sensible transportation nonprofit organization. And I think that you did some work there, and Ted White was there in the early days and some other folks. And yeah. We used to have a human-powered parade that Kat would do.
That's right.
So, Rob, did your work with Friends of Eugene involve any parades? Speaking of parades.
Do you happen to remember the March for a Better Transplant? I think we had, back in 99 or 2000, something like that.
That was before my time because I moved here in 2005.
Yeah. Back then, I recall being part of a more divided community where there are people who drove cars and people who walked and bicycle, and they were totally different people that just saw the world totally differently. And some were like business people and some were environmentalists, and they fought with each other. And I guess I was on one side of that. And I was called Mr. Transplant, but Tom Schwetz, who was at Elcock at the time, was also called Mr. Transplant. And I think we're on opposite sides of things, but that was a long time ago. I would say that in my work more recently with BEST, we work really hard to bring people together and encompass a triple bottom line of business interests, environmental interests, and social service interests. And I've actually seen a lot of common ground that has helped move our community forward more recently.
And I'll use this opportunity to plug our Flashback Friday event. So the last one of these that we're going to be doing on May 29th is our Flashback Friday, where we're going to talk about the history of cycling in Eugene. So some of those 90s, but also going back to the 70s and even into the early 1900s, and talking about some of the transportation pictures, especially around biking in Eugene and sort of the roots of that. So tune in for more history. And then Rebecca?
So I was someone who went to college and then to graduate school and then got a job as a professor right after. So I don't have very many real jobs in my repertoire other than the one that I'm in now. But I started doing more research on transportation as a master's student, and then into a graduate, a PhD student. My dissertation focused on Maryland's Smart Growth Program, which required that funding for infrastructure could only be spent in priority funding areas. So one of the things I got to do was dig through 20 years of state transportation budgets because they weren't coded in a way that could go into a spreadsheet. And so we manually coded every single transportation project and where it was located in a big Excel spreadsheet. So that, I would say, was my first dive into transportation. And I've remained really interested in transportation funding since then, through sort of understanding where money gets spent in the different phases of transportation, what the different funding sources are, and how they all work together.
Well, that's a great segue, because I think it's time to dive into those weeds. And I know that Rob has been working on some funding applications. And so let's throw out our first acronym.
Rob.
Yes, Rob Inerfeld. Yes, that Rob. We'll throw out some acronyms here and talk about the MPO projects and the MPO or the MPO funding. And maybe Rob Inerfeld, you can kick us off with a little bit about what you've been working on, and then let's dive into the weeds. And Rebecca and Zako, throw some questions at Rob, and let's get the conversation started.
So every metropolitan area in the country of 50,000 or more people is required by the federal government to have a metropolitan planning organization in order to receive federal transportation funding, or even for like their state Department of Transportation to spend that money in their metro area. So our MPO, as they're called, is called the Central Lane Metropolitan Planning Organization. And City of Eugene is one of several agencies that participates in it. The others are cities of Springfield and Coburg, in Lane County, Lane Transit District, and ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation. And the MPO receives around around $7 million a year that it distributes to its member agencies. And about every 3 years, the MPO programs most of these funds to projects that the different member agencies, except for ODOT, put forward. So we just submitted 8 projects today for the current funding round. I could go through them concisely, Shane, if you think that would be a good idea.
Yeah, or briefly, just mention what they are,
briefly.
and then
Sure.
We can see which ones are of interest. But to give people an idea of the breadth.
One of them is on 8th Avenue, and it would be we already have a project underway to make 8th Avenue 2-way in the downtown and add protected bike lanes, but we don't have enough money. The cost estimates came in high, so we're requesting around another $800,000 for that. We're also proposing to extend our West Bank path up through the west side of the Delta Sand and Gravel property in the Santa Clara neighborhood to go all the way up to the end of Admiral Street that connects to Wilkes Drive and our future Santa Clara Community Park. The third project is to build 3 temporary roundabouts, sort of a category of what we call tactical urbanism on Division Avenue between River Road and Lone Oak, also in the Santa Clara neighborhood. And then there's a third project in the Santa Clara neighborhood, which is to build out Hunsaker Lane to complete street standards. So with sidewalks and bike lanes and stormwater between Tato Street and River Road. So really that whole section of Hunsaker Lane, it would provide full pedestrian and bicycle connectivity to the neighborhoods on either side of that street. And there's a lot of lower income folks who live on the south side of Hunsaker, and it would give those people access to the new Santa Clara Transit Center that LTD is building. We also applied for a project that's dear to Shane's heart, which is to continue doing our Smart Trips transportation options work. Another project is more of a planning study, and it's to look at our top 23 most dangerous intersections in Eugene, what we call our Vision Zero intersections, and come up with design concepts for how to make them safer. And then there's 2 more projects on the other side of the river. One is looking at building a roundabout on Coburg Road at Oakway Street, because there's a lot of delay for vehicles there, and there's also been a lot of crashes for people using all modes. And then the last one is looking at right next to that, it would actually connect to it, which is to build protected bike lanes on Oakway Street from Coburg Road all the way to Cal Young. So one thing we found is that we don't have room within Coburg Road itself to build a protected bike lane network. So we're looking at creating a network on some of the side streets in that neighborhood to help people travel in a north and south direction to get, to tie into our shared use path system and the protected bike lane network that we're building downtown. I think that covers all of it, Shane.
Great. So Zako or Rebecca Lewis, thoughts or questions on that? I know, that's some of the, as I mentioned, the MPO funding, and this is 2022 to 2024 that we're looking at.
I think one thing, Rob, for people to sort of understand and think about generally, how do those projects align with the plans that are in place in Eugene? So, sort of where did those projects originate from?
Right.
And what are the plans that they're linked in that sort of serve as the basis of moving forward to ask for funding for them?
So 2 of our key transportation plans in Eugene are our transportation system plan, so what we call our TSP, and that is sort of our blueprint for what projects we're going to build over the next 20 years by 2035, because it was finished in 2015. So it's to meet the goals that we set and that our city council adopted. And one of those goals is to triple the percentage of trips in Eugene that are made by walking and biking and public transportation. There's other goals around safety, livability, economic development, and equity. So that's one of the plans, and a lot of these projects you can find listed in the TSP. Another important plan is our Vision Zero Action Plan, which Rob Zako of Better Eugene Springfield Transportation actually brought that to our city council several years ago and said we need a plan in Eugene to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries in our transportation system. So through that planning, we identified corridors that had the highest numbers of crashes for people walking and biking and traveling in motor vehicles. So some examples are Coburg Road is one of our Vision Zero corridors. Division Avenue is not one of our Vision Zero corridors, but the intersection with Lone Oak, where we're proposing a roundabout, is one of our Vision Zero intersections. And then the projects on Oakway and 8th Avenue and the West Bank Path Extension and Hunsaker Lane are all projects identified in our transportation system plan.
So I just want to throw up a couple comments that we've gotten. From Jessica saying, yes, the Coburg and Oakway is long overdue. So that is an exciting one. It'll take a few years to actually happen. And I think that's a good point. Maybe, Rebecca, you want to talk about, you mentioned before we got on live about sort of the timeline that it takes for these things to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's sort of interesting, and I saw this early on when I was doing that look at Maryland's transportation projects, is that projects, it's not like you conceive of a project one year and then it's built the very next year. They have a really, really long life cycle. And so there's projects that have been around and, quote, on the books for decades that maybe never get built, maybe have like what Rob's mentioning in terms of planning studies and they decide not to go forward with them. But I think something that's important to understand is that this process takes a long time from when a project gets thought of to when you actually sort of put it in a plan, it gets funding, and then it gets built. That whole cycle, it can be fast, but I mean, Rob Inerfeld, what would you say is like the fastest project that has been built from like an idea to you can actually use it?
That's a good question. I don't know. I have to really rack my brain on that. I mean, projects that we do with local funding, we can do a lot faster, and especially if they're not in like a protected waterway area where they don't need special permitting. I think like Shane might remember this one, but the buffered bike lanes we put on 24th, I feel like we did that pretty quickly. One project that was really fast is when we took parking off 13th and a travel lane from Garfield to Washington. So we took a travel lane off from Garfield to Chambers and then the parking all the rest of the way. And that was a really quick project. And what's interesting is, people say we should do road diets or remove travel lanes. And like we took a travel lane off the busy street in 13th there. And I don't think most people didn't even really notice because the traffic was so light on it. So it's really the more, we've done a lot of projects where we remove parking and in that case a travel lane, and they often fly under the radar. It's the more contentious ones like South Limit Street that people tend to notice more, and those tend to take longer.
And Rob, I think you touched on this one, but I just want to throw Alpha's question up there about which what intersections are considered the most dangerous. But I think you touched a little bit on that talking about the study.
I can add a little bit, which is I think the highest crash intersection in Eugene is Roosevelt and Highway 99. And we're actually building a bike path on the north side of Roosevelt right now from Highway 99 to Maple Street. And as part of that, we're making the slip lane, I think for the southbound to westbound right turn from 99 onto Roosevelt, we're building a raised crosswalk there to protect people biking and walking across there. So that should help a little bit there, but we don't have a real, we've talked about trying to build a roundabout at that intersection because roundabouts are just so much safer than signalized intersections, but we haven't really gotten very far with that.
Yeah, I heard from Reed, who went out and did a site visit there today, that a good portion of the shared use path is done and that they were working on the slip lane raised crossing. So that's exciting.
Great. Yeah.
Let me ask Rob a question. Speaking about how long it takes to get projects developed, a big project I know that you've been working on is the Franklin Boulevard transformation. And part of the impetus for that is that before COVID-19, we were planning to have the World Track and Field event in 2021. And there was at least some desire to say, could we get that in place in time to move people there? Can you tell us a little bit of why it takes longer than just a year or two to do something like that, and some of the steps involved in getting a big project like that built?
Okay, and just to be clear, we were not even hoping to get that built by the World Track and Field Championships. So
okay, I was hoping,
but okay, yeah. There's just a lot of steps when you have a federalized transportation project. There's a lot of steps that you need to go through with the State Department of Transportation, and if there's transit, the Federal Transit Administration is sometimes involved. And that project has, it's very ambitious. We're trying to have one MX lane in each direction, where right now we only have one bidirectional lane along most of it. We're going to be needing to acquire right-of-way from private property owners and businesses, and we're trying to limit the impacts to them. And there's a lot of different special studies you have to do for NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And I'm not an expert at it. We have engineers that are really good at doing those kinds of things. There's also, you have to do a survey, so you really understand exactly what's out there. Let's see, I'm just trying to think if there's other key steps that I'm missing.
Well, let me play devil's advocate. I mean, this is a city street, right?
Right.
So why are you applying for federal money? Why don't you just use city money to build a project like this? Would that be faster?
Right. It would be, but we don't have that kind of money. The projects, we think it's going to cost somewhere from like $40 to $60 million to build it. So it's really expensive. That's why we're applying for a federal build grant of $25 million. We're partnering with the city of Springfield, and if we're successful, only 15 of that would come to Eugene. But we do have some sources of local and state funding that we would be using too. So collectively, a first phase in Eugene could be as much as like $23 million.
I knew that. It's sort of the point here, and Rebecca and I have looked at this. I mean, part of the challenge with transportation planning and funding is that we don't have the local sources to do everything we want to do. And so we need the state, especially the federal government, as a partner. And even things that you might think are really a local or city issue end up having this larger government involvement and requiring the steps that you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. All right. I have to submit one final project to the MPO, so I'm going to not be paying attention for just a minute there.
But I would say, too, that there's, and this is going to be even more relevant currently and in a post-COVID world, we fund most of our transportation system through things like gas taxes and user fees. And so right now, when the transportation system isn't being used as heavily during social distancing, we aren't bringing in as much revenue. We've already had a federal highway trust fund that's basically on the cusp of going bankrupt. And so we have massive issues in terms of paying for transportation projects already. And without some large federal action, probably through some sort of massive stimulus, I think those things are going to get a lot worse. One of the projects I was working on a year ago was on the impact of autonomous vehicles on transportation revenues, which raises a lot of red flags as well in terms of vehicle registration, driver's licenses, and gas taxes as we think about shifting to an electric future. So there's a big need to think more strategically about how we're paying for transportation, aside from the issues of sort of local sources, largely driven by this sort of reliance on this highway trust fund and a gas tax that is out of date, for the easiest way to put it.
Well, that's a great little segue into bringing our next guest on. We can, we haven't really even talked about COVID-19, but I think just thinking about federal funding and thinking about sort of where those federal dollars are coming from and how they're being spent, and thinking about the stimulus package that's come out and whether there's, other funding that might be available. I know that we have someone here as a special guest who can talk to us a little bit about federal funds, and happens to be a Oregon grad, and excited to bring Joe on and have him give us some words about what's happening back east and reminisce a little bit about Eugene even.
Howdy.
Hey there. Welcome.
How we doing?
Pretty good. How you doing?
I can't complain.
Excellent. So I don't know if you were able to hear some of what we've been talking about. We've been talking about a little bit of the funding and where these local dollars are, and why don't we just build things with our local money? And it's because we don't have enough. We need more from the federal, and where those federal money is coming from. And maybe I think Rebecca, maybe you have a good guiding question for Joe on that one.
I think it'd be, Joe, do you want to introduce yourself and say what you've been up to since you left us here at Oregon? That might be a good sort of lead into
it's great.
Talking about everything you know about the ins and outs of Congress and federal funding.
Yeah, no, it's great to see friends here. So, hey Shane, hey Rob, hey Rebecca, Rob Inerfeld, good to see you too. Joe McAndrew, back in the day, cut my teeth working with Rob and team trying to secure the votes that were needed on council for the West Eugene MX. May or may not have gotten after a little bit of a design product for students to try to design the 13th Street two-way bicycle track, which, you know, I've heard through the grapevine, some folks have been sending me a few links here and there. Is that really actually finally going to happen?
It's under construction. It's
wow.
They're building. We're building the yeah. It's pretty awesome. It's pretty amazing. I think that we're building the curb cuts and doing the basic work, laying the foundations for the bike signals and the new traffic lights, and it's pretty awesome.
That is cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, so it's, you know, and that's one of those things for those who don't know, the 13th Avenue two-way protected bikeway that we're putting in, that started construction this spring, was a project that was started at the University of Oregon and really was sort of an advocacy push by a student group, Live Move, that really worked on a lot of design and really worked with the city in partnership to make it happen. And so that project alone has a really great history around sort of, you know, advocacy and then funding and where that funding comes from all different areas, because that's one of those projects that we sort of like piecemeal these different parts to fit into one project. And you know, to see that now hit the ground, it's pretty exciting. Yeah,
no, I'm excited to come back and check it out once the paint dries. But so Joe McAndrew, I have a planning degree from the University of Oregon, very proud alum. I spent a few years working on the House side out here for an Iowa congressman before going to planning school, and then came back and worked as a policy director for Transportation for America, a national advocacy group, working with many partners in Oregon and throughout the country to try to reform the federal transportation program to make sure we're spending the money on those projects that return the greatest benefit to the community. Since I took a short stint in 2016 and 2017 to go to the Hill, thinking there was an infrastructure package that may or may not happen. It didn't happen. It hasn't happened. So I left, and I'm now working for a group called the Greater Washington Partnership. It's the civic alliance of the leading CEOs, 28 of them from Baltimore to Richmond, focusing on those issues that kind of hold back a region's economy and society to thrive. And in this region, from Baltimore to Richmond, you know, every day 50% of the residents wake up in one jurisdiction and work in another. 20% cross the state border. Sadly, you know, in an area where you've got the federal government and 2 states and the District of Columbia, nobody's planning for those commutes, and it's critically important for the employers that we improve the ability for more residents to access destinations and work sites, or else the congestion or the lack of progress on transit is ultimately going to choke our ability to continue to grow and thrive. So the group was behind the Amazon HQ2 deal. It was behind a 2018 Metro funding deal. We were the largest transit agency in the country here in DC without a funding source, a dedicated funding source that we can bond against. And our system was 40 years old and needed to recapitalize. So we secured $500 million into perpetuity in 2018 to put the system back to good and start to grow the system. Working on bridges and historic rail deals in Virginia as well. So, but in terms of Congress, I can spend all day talking about that. That's a challenging one, right?
Mm.
They do, yeah. Well, and it's so ironic because like I talked.
All right. So Rebecca and Rob, Zako, I'm going to leave it up to you to sort of guide the conversation. I'm going to go. Oh.
So Joe, why don't we have enough money to do what we want to do locally in transportation?
Well, I mean, there's two reasons, Rob. One, the locals need to raise revenue for their priorities, right? If transportation is a priority, they need to invest in it. But two, the federal government needs to invest in it as well. We haven't raised the federal gas tax since 1993. At that point in time, I was 7. Many folks didn't have a cell phone. We were still probably working off of tape recorder decks. Hey, Rob. And the federal government hasn't raised the gas tax in a quarter century. So, at the end of the day, if we can't invest in our assets of importance in terms of connecting our communities, whether it be within the city or intercity, we're not going to be able to continue to grow and play in the big leagues in terms of global competition. So.
Let me just, and I knew that, Joe, but as a math guy, let me just clarify. In fact, the federal government is lowering the gas tax every year, year after year, not by action, by inaction. Because of inflation, that same gas tax of 18.5 cents that was when Bill Clinton was president, each year is worth less and less. So we're actually lowering our taxes year after year. And so it's not surprising that we struggle to fund things we want to do.
Not to mention, so we now have more fuel efficient cars, which is great, but we pay a per gallon gas tax. And so if you make cars that use fewer gallons, we suddenly are selling less gas. And so between those two hits on revenue, we're seeing these sort of mass declines in gas tax available for funding projects, which I'm a huge proponent of a vehicle miles traveled fee, of something that more equates the actual use of the system. But so far it's faced a lot of challenges from Congress and from political support to move towards something like that.
Well, I think,
here in Oregon, where we have that fee, what's it called, Origo?
Mm-hmm.
I think it charges the same price per mile regardless of how fuel efficient your vehicle is. So to the extent that with gas tax, at least there's sort of a little bit of a financial incentive to drive a more fuel efficient vehicle. And it feels like we're moving backwards a little bit with the VMT fee in that regard.
A little bit. I think at some point in time we need to figure out, how to fund it, right? Other countries over in Europe, pay for their transportation system out of their general fund and pay more on an annual basis than we do here in the U.S. I think there are a few folks in out here that say that if you want to be able to compete globally, you got to be able to invest to be able to play in the big leagues. And I think that that's a really important item in transportation. And Rob, you know this, right? Like when an upstart student group comes to you with an idea out of the middle of the night and wants you to fund it, you've got 27 or probably 100 different priorities that you need to fund on a given year. And you need to be able to prioritize those investments that are going to provide the greatest return. And I think that's in the transportation space, one item that we have a tough time with, both prioritizing the investments, but also making sure that we can expand and invest where we need. We need the revenue, or we need additional revenue. COVID-19 isn't going to help this situation. I haven't seen I haven't seen Oregon's revenue impacts, but we're expecting out here on the East Coast impacts that are going to far exceed what we saw in 2008, 2009 in terms of highway trust fund revenue or trust fund revenue for our state's gas tax, sales tax, and other fees that are coming into the system. So we're in a position without Congress stepping in, whether it be in a short-term stimulus rescue package or a longer-term authorization, a federal authorization for multiple years, and raising the gas tax or other revenue sources. The transportation system, both at the state level, looks a little dire because of the COVID situation, and outside of a massive infusion of cash from the general fund or other mechanisms, we're in a bit of trouble.
Great. So I just want to say we are getting a little bit of background noise from you, Joe. So once in a while I'm cutting you off there and then Rob, I don't know if you got your audio issues worked out a bit, but we heard a little bit from you too when you were just coming back on there. So maybe, but I did throw up a question a bit ago from Sue asking about how helpful it is to have for Eugene, how helpful is it that Peter DeFazio chairs the Transportation Committee? I think Joe might have some thoughts on that one, but maybe if I know Zako as well, probably have some.
Well, I'm gonna toss it over to Rob Inerfeld and see how helpful you've experienced him being. I can talk about how we try to work with him.
How about you, Rob? How's your audio doing? Inerfeld, he might be having some.
Why don't you unmute yourself?
Hey there, sorry, I'm having some audio issues. For some reason, I don't hear Joe. I hear everybody else talking, but not Joe. So anyway, can you all hear me?
Yeah, except now we're hearing other things too.
Hang on, I'm having a problem because I logged onto my computer so I could hear Joe, and now. Anyway, can you all hear me? I need to close it.
we hear you in your
Sorry.
Echo. That's okay.
All right.
Let me take a stab at this. I mean, Congressman DeFazio has been in Congress for what, 32 years now, and only in the last couple of years, well, actually since last year, has he risen to be chair of the important House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. He's been a great ally. He's been hugely helpful to our community. That said, Congress has phased out earmarks. It used to be that powerful members of Congress would bring back projects to their community. Rob and Joe, you may know better than me, but my sense is that we're seeing less of that, that we have more competitive grants and you have to go through a process to get federal funding.
Yes. So earmarks have gone away. I know they're talking about potentially bringing them back, but, and there's some, I don't know all the projects that we have in Eugene because earmarks went around that had earmarks, but because they went away around the time that I got here in 2005. But some important projects that did receive earmarks were the Delta Ponds pedestrian and bicycle bridge that received an earmark of $1 million or $2 million. The DeFazio Bridge was actually a part of an earmark, I believe, that was supposed to be for widening the Ferry Street Bridge, but Rob Zako was probably involved in opposing that widening for motor vehicles, and so I don't know if there were any parades involved or marches, but I think the city tried to basically turn lemons into lemonade there, and instead made improvements to that general area. So a lot of those paths that we have along the south end of Coburg Road and then the DeFazio Bridge were built with those funds. Those are the two projects I'm aware of that were built with earmarks. And I think, we've always been hopeful that as he's moved into higher and higher leadership positions on the Transportation Committee, that there'd be more to show for that. But I think because of the divisiveness in Congress, it's just been such a struggle to get bills passed that were provided better funding options for transportation, for multimodal transportation. And, I think he's been probably, Joe will, I'm sure, know a lot more about this than I do, but I imagine he's been helpful at the federal level at getting programs like Tiger and Build funded. And those are programs that fund multimodal transportation. But what's been really disappointing, I know this is all what I'm saying is much more than just DeFazio, but it's just been disappointing the programs that specifically are for non-motorized or active transportation have really kind of withered away over time, and they're just not very big right now. And it's just, I guess I'm cautiously optimistic that if the Democrats take over Congress and if DeFazio is still in that role, that we could get some stronger funding programs for active transportation.
I agree. In terms of Congressman DeFazio, you've got a true champion for the local and regional issues that the folks on the phone are interested in. I'd say at the federal level, just looking across the landscape, he's probably one of the more progressive transportation thinkers, trying to change the surface transportation program to address things like non-driving trip options, trying to lower the amount of greenhouse gases that come out of our transportation system. He's certainly a proponent of raising transportation revenues and spending it better. And I'd say, until he is one of 435 voting members in the House of Representatives, but he's a senior member, a respected member, and he's in the majority party. So he's got a bit of sway. I will say though, I'm sad to hear that you guys have a build grant in, because typically on these discretionary grants we compete again on merit. But there's also, a little bit of political sway when a chairman says he'd like a grant to be funded. Typically, the U.S. Department of Transportation ranks that as a high priority relative to others in terms of a rank and file. One of the other 434 members in the House of Representatives. So, we've got great applications going in out here on BRT and redoing Baltimore Penn Station, but having Congressman DeFazio prioritize and advocate on these discretionary grants is also a huge opportunity that you shouldn't look past.
So I'm sorry, why are you sad to hear that we have one going in? Are we competing?
I love Eugene, but I also really have a great train station I'm looking to redo.
It's only $25 million. It's not a lot of bacon, Joe.
Yeah, I only need
Joe,
15.
I couldn't hear you before. I couldn't hear what you were talking about, but I used to live in Baltimore, and so I did frequent the Penn Station in Baltimore, if that's what you're working on. So, and
guys,
Baltimore is a great city.
Yeah, 8th busiest train station in the country. It needs some love.
Wow.
Let's spread it. You get some, we get some. Let's make sure we all are happy at the end of the day.
And Joe, since I missed before, just real quick, what are you doing now? Who are you working for?
Yeah, it's a group called the Greater Washington Partnership. So I don't know if there's an analog.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know if there's an analog out there in the Eugene or Oregon area, but a group of CEOs.
Okay.
So let me throw out a question in the group. It's been, about 2 months now since COVID-19 has become part of life, and what changes are we seeing as a result of that immediately, and what do other panelists see this might change in the way we think about transportation in our country? Maybe if I can just, Rob, what's different in Eugene now the last 2 months with people staying at home more? What are you seeing on the streets that's different?
Right. I mean, frankly, I have not been out a lot, and I'm working at home. I'm not in my normal windowless office in the Wells Fargo building downtown. I'm here on my back deck with some greenery and birds and stuff. The number of we are monitoring traffic volumes in Eugene, and they're down a lot. So, but they are starting to creep back up, and so I think people are just obviously seeing that when they're out and about, is that there's a lot less traffic. We're seeing a lot lower ridership on Lane Transit District. I think LTD is down from a typical day of around 35,000 boardings a day, and now they're around 10,000 boardings a day. Peace Health Rides, I think, is down from around 900 trips a day to, I haven't seen the latest, but it might be around 100 per day. So that's also way down. So people are traveling less than they were before by lots of different modes. Another thing too is there's a lot fewer vehicle crashes. Well, all kinds of crashes in Eugene are way down, from what we can tell, by more than half.
And I have family still in Portland. They tell me Oregon has done a really good job of bending the curve and managing as best they can. You know, out here in this area, we are still increasing or stabilizing, I guess is the best way to put it. In the next week or so, we expect to stabilize a bit. But I think one of the more interesting things, there's two items. One, Congress is going to provide support and aid, right? It's been through support to airports and airlines. In the transportation sector, there was $25 billion for assistance to transit agencies to make sure that they can continue to operate in a previous bill. And there was also assistance to Amtrak. There's still a bit of debate on what's going to happen next. The House just passed a bill or moved a bill today. There's $15 billion. It's not an insignificant amount of money. Billion to support state DOTs budgets, right? Because if folks aren't driving, the gas tax aren't coming in, and you know, there's questions in terms of whether or not you can get a project done. There's also additional money, additional $15 billion for transit agencies, because I think this is the question, and Eugene's a different beast than Portland. It's a different beast than the area that I cover. But the return of, I hate the term, but choice riders being able to come back to transit in the near term is one that for employers, our employers are, you know, everybody from Exelon to Under Armour to T. Rowe Price and Capital One and JP Morgan. You know, they've pulsed their employee base, and one of the biggest concerns or threats for a lot of employees in terms of returning to work isn't, you know, the conversation at the water cooler, but rather they rely on transit to get to work, and they're concerned about getting on a transit vehicle in close proximity to hundreds of other people. And it's tough to meter that and control that flow. And so I think in terms of transit and the return of transit, I think you're going to see more people return to driving that have the ability to return to driving when the operations come back online and the stay-at-home orders start to ease up a bit. But I think that longer-term impact to transit ridership and farebox revenue return is going to be slower, more gradual, and we're going to have to think about this. I will say, you know, we have a group called the Champions of the Commute out here, and all of the employers on our board are part of it, and we're trying to dial up 3 to 5% mode share from the employer base. They have 250,000 employees every day that get to work, and they themselves create demand and create congestion. What's fascinating is there are a number of employers that didn't think telework was a key priority on March 15th, right? There were a few of them that didn't even have telework policies. They created those overnight, and they're learning what it means for continuity of operations and resiliency today. But longer term, you know, the question of whether or not these employers are going to keep these programs in place, how they're going to keep these programs in place, you know, when these employees are going to want to come back to work. I think it's really going to be regional specific in terms of what testing and PPE is available and the level of confidence that the employers and the employees have. But out here, we're not expecting to really see some normalcy until late 2020, if not 2021 at the earliest. It's going to be interesting.
So I want to ask, Joe, I know you have to leave us soon. I want to ask one question that kind of gets at the conversation we had when we started around the TSP and how we think about projects. I think this is a relevant question as we think about COVID recovery, because if there is a stimulus that's coming forward, how do we decide which projects get funded and sort of what goes first? And you raise a really good point around transit and how transit might be viewed relative to other things. So I think, Rob Inerfeld, you're probably the best person to answer that question around sort of, how did you decide which projects to send forward for funding today? And Joe, from your perspective, what do you see at a federal level? It kind of goes back to your comment on the build grant.
So are you, I was looking at some of the questions, Rebecca. Were you restating Sue Walling's question
Yes.
about how do we decide what to prioritize for funding?
Yeah.
It's tough. You know, for this current round of funding, we did create a matrix. Actually, Reed Dunbar, who's on my staff, he took all of the pedestrian and bicycle projects in the TSP, of which there are hundreds, and he basically organized them, and he used our GIS system to basically look at things like proximity to schools, proximity to Title I schools, which are serving lower income student populations, whether they were in our near a bus stop, and a bunch of different factors. And we used that to see which projects rose to the top. And that's partially how we decided what projects to apply for funding for. We also look for opportunities. So there's been a lot of planning work in the River Road and Santa Clara neighborhoods. And that was partially why we decided to prioritize the Hunsaker Lane project and also the West Bank Path extension. Those sometimes too is just based on the fact that those are projects that have had a lot of community involvement or planning work going on in the past, so we're building on that. Sometimes it's about building out the network. So Oakway protected bike lanes is about, you know, building out that protected bike lane network by not just doing an isolated protected bike lane out somewhere in the community, but trying to create a network that combines together our protected bike lanes and our shared use paths, and to some extent our neighborhood greenways. So trying to create that connectivity for people walking and biking. Equity is an issue. I think that's partially why we were trying to prioritize some projects in parts of Santa Clara that haven't seen as much attention. Also, the Division Avenue project was just, our traffic operations staff had just been seeing a lot of crushes out there. So that was partially responding to something more immediate. And that's also why we chose a tactical urbanism project there that's less expensive, because it's something that we can deploy more quickly.
Yeah, at the federal level, I think this is different than 2008, 2009. Yet it could get back there. In 2009, it was a lot of stabilizing funding sources, but putting money towards state and local government, NPOs, et cetera, transit agencies for what quote unquote shovel-ready projects. We were trying to create jobs and keep people on jobs. This one's a little different. The budget impact was so quick and swift that without some level of stabilization on those funds, there's a question of whether or not we're going to start to lay off DOT personnel throughout the country. I'm not an expert in Oregon anymore in terms of their budget, but it's a very real threat. Without some level of aid coming through, the projects are going to get delayed, and with that, both public and private folks are going to start to get unemployed at a time when we're not looking for it. So I think, to the question whether or not the next bill will provide stabilization funds for highways, transit, and other modes of transportation, I think it's anybody's guess. The House put out their marker today. The Senate doesn't expect to move anytime soon, maybe June, maybe July. And at which point in time, the sand can change, and we can be looking at a different type of recovery type of effort. What I would advise anybody to, as you're kind of projecting what to think about it, prepare for a baseline assistance to keep the lights on, right? How do you backfill the lost transportation revenues that we've seen since mid-March through today and probably for the foreseeable future for a few more months? Prepare those shovel-ready lists, right? So it's good that Rob and Reed and team are already starting to prepare those lists. Get them ready, because you never know how the next one's going to shake out. Having Congressman DeFazio closer to the conversation, you'll probably get a little bit of a head nod 24 hours before everyone else. But that list will be important, because if there's going to be a discretionary grant funding pot of a supercharged build program of, this year there's, I think, $1 billion. It could be anywhere from $5 to $10 billion in terms of a big discretionary nationwide grant to try to put people back on jobs. So I think, prepare the list as if you're going to compete. But it's I wish I could tell you with some level of certainty where we're going, but at this juncture, if I had the answer for you, I'd be making a lot of money right now. But
one project that I'd love to do. We historically, when we've had opportunities like that, we've put the funding towards paving streets because those are projects that you can put out pretty quickly. The last stimulus we did, we did receive, I think, around $1 million in stimulus funds for the Delta Ponds Bridge that I mentioned earlier. So it actually had an earmark from DeFazio and stimulus funds in it. There are some paths in Eugene that I think could stand to be repaved, and one in particular that comes to mind for me is the Roosevelt Path in the Bethel neighborhood. So we're building a new section right now from Highway 99 to Maple, but then west of there, it's just an awful condition, and it would be great to get that section of path resurfaced. So, if people have thoughts or suggestions for projects to build with stimulus funds, think about, is it something that we could do that is not near a waterway, that wouldn't involve a lot of really serious construction work, but that's more of an overlay type project, or something that would be more of a tactical urbanism type project, kind of like if you look at the short protected bike lane we did on 13th near Cafe Soraya, that was the kind of thing that could be deployed more quickly, where it's using prefabricated curb and flexible bollards.
That's great. I'm going to run. I've got a little pizza to eat out here. So thank you very much. Good to see everybody.
Thanks so much.
It's great seeing friends. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Great. Well, I wanted to take this little break in the conversation to throw up our first little trivia question here. So we talked a little bit about at the federal level. And so I just wanted to throw this out, and this isn't for our panel. I want to see if anyone listening in, watching us, can answer who is the U.S. Secretary of Transportation. So this is either someone who knows it and can type it in really fast, or see who has the best Google experience and can get something into the comments, and then just sort of
we could ask.
Say that again.
I just sent a letter to this person, but I won't say.
Oh, okay.
The follow-up question could be who's her husband?
Oh, that's too easy, Rob. I tried to be gender neutral here.
Sorry.
Oh, we got a hint.
Oh man, yeah, you're right. I just gave away their gender.
Oh man.
Oh, all right. Let's see if we got a couple guesses in. Oh, yes, Sue Wolling.
By the way, I heard Sue Walling on national NPR a couple of weeks ago. That was very exciting.
Really?
She was on one of the call-in on All Things Considered or something. Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, I gotta hear that story.
It was a COVID-19 question. I can't remember exactly.
The COVID-19 question.
What it is. I think it was. I can't remember exactly what it was.
Tell us what the
question. What did you ask, Sue?
Yeah, we want to hear that. Let's see. And spelling does count, and I think you didn't get it right. That's right. It's CHAO. AO Chow. So and Rob, I actually have to say I don't know who her husband is.
Senator McConnell from Kentucky.
Oh, right. So Kevin gets that one.
Mitch McConnell. He needs to work on his spelling too, I think. But
yeah.
He didn't spell his last name right either. So I mean, it's Kevin's last name. I mean, yeah.
Oh, he didn't spell his own name right.
Right. Yeah.
He
doesn't.
It's a social media thing. So let's see. Next question that I have. Next trivia question I have is bringing it back to local. So let's throw this up here. And what year did the City Council of Eugene officially adopt Eugene's first bikeway master plan? So first, you guys know what year? Have guesses? Don't say them out loud, but so I'll throw that up there one more time, actually. The City Council first adopted Eugene's first bikeways master plan. So we've got, Kevin says he knows it. We'll see. Let's hear. Did you work on this, Rob? Just kidding.
And a follow-up question is, the person who spearheaded it, who was that person married to?
Right.
Wow. Not who was that person, but who were they married to?
So Sue throwing in the first answer again. So that is close, very close. So a couple years off. So I'll give another hint. So we can say, when was the first bike bill passed in Oregon? We can use that as
the only bike bill.
Well, the bike bill, right? When was the bike bill?
The bike bill, right?
Yeah. And that was
the same year as the Eugene.
Nope.
Bikeways master plan? No, okay.
A few years after. So the bike bill in Oregon was passed in 1971, and the next is, so right now it looks like 1973 is our only guess, and 1975 is the answer. So,
wow.
So Sue wins again, the closest answer for our trivia question.
The husband would be Dr. John Bascom, husband to then bicycle advocate and then later Eugene Mayor Ruth Bascom,
who our river path system is named after. Mm-hmm. That's right.
And we'll probably have a photo of her on May 29th, right, Shane?
That's right. We will definitely be talking about Ruth Bascom and the history of in our Flashback Friday and the importance of work that she did. So, all right. So I think that's all that I want to throw up right now for trivia questions. But I wanted to, now that we brought it back local again, and sort of talk about other issues. And I think the really interesting piece was thinking about COVID-19 and sort of how this transportation wonkiness is really going to sort of come to fruition and sort of be thought about under the lens of COVID-19. And when we come out of this, and as we're starting to think about how things are going to shake out, what are things going to look like? And I think especially, Rob, you mentioned before the importance of equity and sort of how is the transportation system going to be different. We talked a little bit about transit use plummeting, and people who have access, that Joe talked about, have access to cars will probably be driving more, but those who don't might be constrained more than ever. And sort of what is our transportation response, and sort of what are the things that are going to be affected by that? I'll throw it open to the.
Let me try to tie together a couple different ideas. Start with COVID-19. We used to think about what are called choice riders and transit-dependent riders, and have these people who, those are poor people and they have to ride the bus. They're dependent upon it. And others, we can drive a car. We have a choice to ride or not. Portland-based transit consultant Jarrett Walker has said that we're all transit dependent now. And his thinking is that if you think about who are the essential workers that are growing our food, are manning our grocery stores and doing things, our nurses and stuff like this, they get to work by transit. And we only survive, all of us, because key people are using the bus to get to work. And so I think he's suggesting that as we move forward, we're going to have to sort of rethink our concepts about what's important, what's not, but also highlighting issues of equity, of who has choices and who doesn't have choices. I'm curious, Rebecca, if in your research or if you've been doing some thinking about the equity aspects.
I think it's a really good point. And even right now, when we are seeing transit systems reduce hours or have to reduce service, there was a keynote yesterday by Salita Reynolds from LA at the Urbanism Next Forum, who gave a really inspiring keynote about what's going on with COVID and how we can address it. She made some really good points around how one of the things that LA is having to think about is you have to run twice as many buses because you can only have half as many people on them. So how do you operate transit effectively in this world with the sort of requirements for social distancing, and really important arguments around essential workers, how now transit operators are essential workers, and how reliant our essential workers are on the transit system. And so when transit agencies across the country are making these cuts, how are people going to get to work? People that have either chosen to be car-free or car-free by necessity now face this important issue. The other thing to note is sort of the sort of idea of how much of that Salita mentioned was how much of our debt is tied up into car ownership, and what that looks like in a world with such mass unemployment as we're seeing now. And so she made the point that we really have to think about better ways to provide for people, given how expensive car ownership is and will continue to be. So one thing that she mentioned was around going back to car sharing programs. Many of them have shut down over time, but solutions like biking and walking and building all our systems, like Rob is mentioning, work really well in Eugene. LA is this massive expanse, and biking and walking alone won't do it. You need biking and walking as the backbone of a transit system. But she was making a pitch to go back to think about car sharing, which is ironic given that all these companies have folded recently, but the need for the public sector to be a key partner in these things, because relying on private businesses can be a challenge in providing what become essential transportation options for people.
But if it's it's interesting though, because if you think about, I keep getting Zipcar ads coming up when I'm looking at like different websites, but Zipcar is the original kind of car sharing where you have to return the car to where you got it from, but it doesn't work very well if you're going to work.
Yeah, she was thinking more of the car-to-go models,
the point-to-point, right?
Yeah.
But that seems like it's even become more extinct as the car-to-go, where they completely pulled out of Portland, whereas Zipcar, it seems like it's kind of interesting because it seems like Zipcar has had more staying power for some reason, and I'm not quite sure why. What about electric scooters? Is that something that works for people who are not just tourists or not just university students? Is that something that can help address some of these equity issues? What do people think? If we had scooter share in Eugene, and if it covered a broader area than Peace Health Rides bike share?
I've certainly, go ahead, Rebecca.
Go ahead, Rob. No, go ahead.
I've certainly heard talk in our community about using e-scooters as first mile, last mile, when Lane Transit District was talking about redesigning their transit system prior to COVID-19 and having to make some hard choices there. Certainly an option was, maybe if you don't live very close to a bus stop, but you're within a mile, could you use an e-scooter to get to and from the bus? I don't know how practical that is, but it's certainly an option for us to discuss and consider.
But now we're talking about maybe not using a scooter. I mean, not riding the bus at all for some people, right? They're wanting to have a little more space, and having a Peace Health Rides bike or an e-scooter might be a more attractive alternative if they can make that trip using that device. So
I think, one of the great things about transit is, and I think it's Jarrett Walker says it, transit extends how far you can get by walking. So you can walk to a bus stop, but you're not going to walk 5 miles from where you live to your job in downtown Eugene or downtown Springfield. You might not take an e-scooter that far. And so there are practical limits of what's a sort of reasonable walking trip, a reasonable e-scooter trip, a reasonable bicycling trip, and longer trips are by bus or driving.
To the question about density and transit, I think I'll tackle the density one more directly. I think that what this crisis, one of the things this crisis has showed us is how important the concept of something like a 20-minute neighborhood is, which is something that is a backbone of how Eugene plans. So if you don't have access to a car and transit isn't as comfortable as an option, having the things that you need in close proximity of your home that you can get to by biking or walking becomes all the more important. So access to particularly things like groceries and pharmacies and those sorts of things become even more important. And so going sort of away to sort of all live in rural areas doesn't necessarily answer the question. There's a huge debate in the planning world right now about density. And what I've noticed is that people tend to say whatever they think supports their previous argument. So Joel Kotkin, for example, who's a pretty strong anti-density person, will say, no, no way. Whereas others who are more pro-density advocates will say the sort of opposite of what affirmed their previously held worldview. I think that there's a lot of debate, and there's a lot of different examples from across the world of we're seeing of dense places that have gotten a grasp on this. And so my sort of reaction is that density alone is not a predictor of what we're seeing, but that doesn't mean that people might not be afraid of it in the future. So regardless of the sort of reality, people might be more afraid of density moving forward.
Right. I saw that Steve Piercy put a comment in about needing to have broader coverage for micromobility, and if we were to have electric scooters here, and we do a request for proposals, which is something we're looking at doing to get one or two e-scooter companies in Eugene, we definitely would want a broader geographic coverage than we currently have for peace-held rides. The challenge is that the economics of that business are probably not as good as they were several months ago, and so my guess is that e-scooter companies probably wouldn't want to be here in Eugene until the U of O is actually back in session, having classes in Eugene. So we're going to be looking at, we had been planning to put out a request for proposals for e-scooter companies to offer services in Eugene starting this fall, but we're going to re-look at that and see what makes sense. Shane, can you put that last question back up? I didn't see what it said. Peaceful rides, people can bike share to work. Fund free credits so people can bike share to work if available. We could, there's a lot, I can't really go into the details, but there's a lot in flux with bike share in Eugene right now. And so we definitely want to do more on the equity side for people that can't have trouble affording it. There is a program that Peace Health Rides has for people on SNAP who are eligible for SNAP, to give them, I think it's either free or discounted rides. And they didn't really market it very much, but as bike share evolves and as we get e-scooters in Eugene, we definitely want to do a better job of having more programs for lower income people, and having, whether they're discounted programs or programs for people who don't have credit cards or smartphones. Those are things that we want to be more attuned to, as well as the kinds of neighborhoods that we're reaching with the service.
I'll jump in with a new topic. We haven't really said much about climate change. Well, I'll start out. I say in the time of COVID-19, with people staying home more, we're seeing less traffic. We're seeing people drive less. We're seeing cleaner air. And so in the short term, things are looking up in terms of climate change. But maybe the longer term trends are not so good. I don't know.
Well, and we're getting, I think nationally, we're sort of getting to what our goals were for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it's only by shutting the economy down and everyone staying home we're able to get there. We can maybe shift to talk a little bit about, there's some cities who are making changes to their streets. I think Seattle permanently closed some certain streets off to cars. Oakland made a big push for safe streets, and Portland did eventually as well. So I think, Rob, Zako, your point around sort of who knows whether this will stick is a really good one. I think telecommuting is sort of one idea of another way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. I think it is important for us to invest in bike ped and try to encourage people to do that and continue to build our networks. How and whether we have the ability to set aside public space and roadways for bike ped during this time is the question I think I would have to put back to Rob and Shane.
Shane, have you talked about our slow streets or Eugene slow streets proposal at all?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it for our family biking one that came up in the questions. Okay. And yeah, it's definitely something I'm happy to talk a little bit about. It's still something that's new, and we're looking at different ways that a lot of people have asked, been writing to city leadership asking about, hey, can we do what Oakland is doing or what Portland is doing, and some other cities, some larger cities are trying this, and I think as a medium-sized city, it's just taken us a little bit more to be able to figure out if it's something that we can do. It's definitely something that we're interested in, and there's some potential to do something. We're just trying to figure out exactly what that's going to look like. We do have a great shared use path network, but that gets crowded, and it's really hard to practice social distancing. We have a decent sidewalk network with definitely some gaps in a lot of neighborhoods, and so even if people are able to have access to sidewalks in their neighborhood, they might not have be able to be a safe distance from one another if there's a lot of people out walking. So what are ways that we can adapt to that? We're looking at our neighborhood greenways, what our existing systems are, and how can we sort of boost those systems. And in certain parts of the city, that's easier because we have a grid system that you have a neighborhood street next to a arterial, and we sort of have things already set up as neighborhood greenways, and we just need to enhance them a little bit. The question is, and when thinking about equity, beyond the core and in other places where neighborhoods aren't as connected, what can we do? Like, how can we create a system that gives people that access to services and access to recreation? And so it's definitely something we're looking at. And now that we're sort of shifting and have some resources available, but also thinking about the long term of like, what can we do around this? So it's something that we're interested in talking more about, and I know probably you want to say any more about it.
Just that it's something we haven't, we're considering this internally within the city organization right now. Shane and his team have put together a great proposal for creating a slow streets program, but we just don't have the official sign off on it yet. But we're optimistic that we will get that. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have more to say next week.
So would we have the money to do that, or is this something where we'd have to apply the federal government for years and years to implement those streets?
No, we'll make it happen. We just needed to get the internal sign off. So we're keeping our fingers crossed.
Yeah, and just down in the weeds a little bit for me is that we generally do a smart trips program and a transportation options programming work and Sunday streets and a lot of great programs through the summer that we're not able to do because of how things are structured. And my hope is to sort of shift what that work is into this COVID-19 response and to a whole new transportation way of thinking around the space that people need in our public right of way. So it's an interesting and exciting time in some ways, hard in some ways, and exciting in other ways. I do want to honor the people who are hanging in and asking questions. And so I'm going to throw up another question here. And let's see. So this is from Steve Piercy, here representing Stolen Bikes Eugene, which I will make a plug for because he also mentioned that the City of Eugene Police Department is no longer registering bikes. And so for those who don't know, for a long time, the City of Eugene registered bikes, but you could also register them in other areas. And Bike Index and 529 are two of the areas, two of the companies that you can register with. And Steve has been working hard as an advocate to get people to register, and wanted to let people know that it no longer happens with the City of Eugene. If you have a bike registered with the police department, you can contact them and sign up your bike or to update your information. But to actually register a bike now, you need to do Bike Index or 529. And he mentions also that bike theft is up in the last 2 months because some property theft has been going up. So bikes being stolen from people's garages and their homes has increased. So keep an eye out for that. So, but to his question, can you discuss what the city is doing to make project statuses more accessible? And so I'll let Rob answer that, but I will. He also asked earlier about something that I showed at the Active Transportation Committee meeting. And I'll bring that up onto the screen here in a second and sort of talk about what we're doing internally and how we might be able to highlight that externally. And maybe Rob can talk a little bit about communications and that.
This is something we know we need to do a better job of, which is letting people know what is the status of different projects that we've been working on, both planning projects, construction projects. We just talked about this at our team meeting this week, And we have a relatively new staff person named Kelsey Moore, who some of you may know because she used to be our Sunday Streets coordinator and also the bike program coordinator at the University of Oregon. But Kelsey is our new community engagement coordinator, and she's going to be working on us providing more information that's relevant about what is the status of our different projects and really getting the word out more to the community about what projects are in different phases, especially what's under construction right now. You know, I was just looking at our website. It's just not really clear what projects are we building right now. There is some information about our 13th Avenue protected bikeway, but you kind of have to dig down a little bit to get to it. Shane is sharing we use this project management tool called Monday, and he's just sharing how he's created this tool he's created to track our projects, but it's really just for our internal use. But yeah, it's something we're working on. We need to do a better job. I would say our website is probably not the best place to look right now. I think social media is somewhere where we're doing a little bit better job of letting people know what's under construction. But Steve, if you want to follow up with us offline or online, offline, you know, if you have specific suggestions about things that we can do to help people understand what's going on, that would be definitely welcome. So thanks for the question.
I'll also take this opportunity to plug the In Motion newsletter. In Motion, we're always putting information there about project updates as much as we can. So make sure you subscribe to that.
Definitely. And you can, if you go to eugene-or.gov/transportation and look for In Motion, but it goes out to like 3,500 people every month. And it's a great resource for staying up to date on what's going on in Eugene and Springfield around transportation.
Great. Let's see. So we've got just about 4 or 5 minutes left. And so if there are any final questions that people want to throw up, I do I'm going to check here and see if anything new's come in. I think, let's see, Jessica, who's been given some really good comments about gender and some discussions going on there. So thanks, Jessica, for calling out some points. And I'll also throw up this little piece here just to highlight that, yes, our sidewalk infrastructure is really something that is something that's tough to get a hold of, because thinking about digging into the weeds of transportation, all those cracks in the sidewalk, those are, you know, supposedly things that people are supposed to do on their own. That, you know, the streets are something that the city maintains. Sidewalks, people are supposed to maintain the sidewalk in front of their home, and a lot of people don't realize that. So.
Right. The city does have a sidewalk maintenance program. And if you bring to their attention that there's a sidewalk that's in need of repair, they will try to get to it. They're pretty backlogged, but if you call during the workday, 682-4800, or just go to Public Works Maintenance's website and just put in a service request, they will try to get to it. The program is just definitely not as robust as we would like for it to be in terms of how much we can do each year in terms of sidewalk repair.
Yeah. So we have just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to ask the panelists here. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I feel like as transportation wonks, we could go on all night talking about some really interesting things. I really appreciate your time in coming to talk about these pieces. Are there some final words that you wanted to say about transportation?
I think we've been on the cusp of a really interesting shift in transportation. Sort of the options that we've seen have opened up tremendously in the past 5 or 10 years in terms of things like transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft and bike share programs, and sort of thinking towards autonomous vehicles, and sort of more classically expanding transit systems in Eugene and expanding bike ped options. But now we're on the cusp of this big pandemic, and we don't really know what transportation is going to look like after. But I think my sort of pitch would be to go back to the transportation systems plan. What are our values as a community? How can we make sure that we go back to those values as we move forward and trying to fund projects? So while this pandemic reflects a change, we've already come to an agreement about what matters to us as a community. So how do we use that to drive what we're doing forward and not just be attracted to the shiny new object and sort of change everything that we were doing because of this, but really think about how it aligns with our values.
Yeah.
Let me follow up on that, and I agree, Rebecca. I don't have a crystal ball in the future, but I have a gut sense that COVID-19 is reinforcing the importance of health, safety, and equity, and making those really much more tangible than they were before. There are values that we've held, things that we've had in our transportation systems plan, but I think there'll be renewed emphasis on advancing those values that we already hold.
I think I really agree with what both of you said, in particular, Rebecca. We have a lot of great projects either under construction right now or soon to be under construction, like the 13th Avenue Protected Bikeway. Next year, we're going to be doing some path lighting projects and building the 8th Avenue Protected Bikeway, and hopefully with something on High and Pearl in the not too distant future. So I'm really excited about a lot that we have in the queue. And I know it's stating the obvious, but telecommuting is just a huge opportunity. It's this thing that's sort of been dropped in our laps, and for not very good reasons. But I do think it is something really important that we should not just go back to the way things were before. Like people have shown they can do this. We can reduce the number of trips that we take by a lot just by working at home some of the time. If everyone worked at home, I mean, obviously a lot of people have jobs where they cannot telecommute, but if people who can did it 1 or 2 days a week, that could be really huge in terms of reducing the amount of vehicle trips that we have all around our country.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we're at time, and so I just want to thank everyone who joined us here on the panel, came in as a guest, and to everyone who watched us and threw in some really great questions. I feel like we had some really interesting conversations, and I encourage everyone to join us on Tuesday. We're going to be talking about bike education. I'll have some local bike educators on, and we'll talk about feeling more confident and safe, getting out there and riding more as we hopefully work on opening streets and encouraging more people to get out and ride more often. And then throughout the month, on every Tuesday and Friday, we'll be touching on some interesting topics. So tune into our transportation planning Facebook page or YouTube. And thanks, Rebecca, Rob, for joining us tonight.
Great. Thanks, Shane, and thanks for all the great questions and comments from the group, from the audience.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shane.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.